Dear students, hello. Today we are going to analyze the chapter 7, the book of the foreign policy analysis. The name of the chapter 7 is Foreign Policy Instruments of States, Diplomacy, Propaganda, Economic Methods. We have three important learning outcomes about this chapter. The first one is distinguish the different types of diplomacy and able to understand diplomatic forms of practice. The second one, understand the difference between the types of economic instruments of foreign policy that the states use in their international relations. And lastly, the third one, know the distinctive levels and ways of implementation of propaganda in international relations. Among the various instruments that states use in their foreign policy implementation, diplomacy, propaganda, and economic tools are in general classified as non-violent instruments of foreign policy. While diplomacy is a non-violent and non-coercive instrument, propaganda could be used coercively when especially coupled with covert actions of state, and some of the economic instruments, such as blockade, can be used both coercively and non-coercively. In this framework, the aim of this chapter is to explain different types of diplomacy, propaganda, and economic measures that states employ in their international dealings. Moreover, various forms of diplomacy and diplomatic practices will be defined, as well as types of economic instruments, and the levels and ways of international propaganda will be described. One of the oldest instruments of foreign policy, diplomacy, is a tool with which the states address the other states and communicate with them in order to explain their national goals, policies, and views on current affairs, and try to influence their intercultural views and positions on issues that are important to them. Sometimes being defined as an art, diplomacy traditionally meant the way to manage one sovereign state's relations with other mutually recognized states. The origins of diplomacy could be traced back to antique time. However, modern understanding of organized diplomacy dates from the Congress of Vienna in 1815 and the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1880s, where the practices of diplomatic service and diplomatic rank, as well as rules of protocol, were agreed upon by the attendants. Initially confined to relations between states in Europe, the rules of diplomacy gradually adopted by the other states and came to apply globally by the 20th century. There are various types of diplomacy, such as bilateral, multilateral, semi ad hoc, parliamentary, open or secret, quiet, and coercive diplomacy. Ad hoc diplomacy is the oldest form of diplomacy involving a special or temporary envoy sent a specific mission. It can be bilateral or multilateral. While bilateral diplomacy contains only two parties, multilateral diplomacy involves more than two parties. Conference diplomacy is the most common form of the multilateral diplomacy. Somewhat similar to conference diplomacy, summit diplomacy requires specific time and location of a meeting between the leaders of a state. Although diplomacy is normally conducted by the diplomatic staff and occasionally by the heads of state or government, in some cases parliamentaries may also have duties in terms of diplomacy, which is then called parliamentary diplomacy. Apart from the types of diplomacy based on the involved parties, it is also important to distinguish between different types of based on style, such as quiet diplomacy, open or secret diplomacy, and coercive diplomacy. Quiet diplomacy is often used by international organizations to discuss a particular situation away from international and domestic pressures or public opinion. However, this shouldn't be confused with the secret diplomacy, which mainly refers to behind the doors actions of states to achieve certain agreements in secret. Within the context of quiet diplomacy, instead of publishing the statements on the concerned topics, the involved countries and organizational representatives keep silent or keep their silence until a solution is found in order to prevent falling effects of third-party, domestic, or international involvement. As the secret diplomacy was historically associated with wars and conflicts in international relations, the concept of open diplomacy emerged in order to prevent conflicts emerging as a result of unfair aspects of such secret arrangements. Finally, although the essence of diplomacy is solving problems with peaceful means, coercive diplomacy can sometimes be used to achieve objectives with the use or threat of use of military force. Open diplomacy is a term developed by the USA President Woodrow Wilson in his famous 14 points published at the end of the World War I as a reaction to the secret diplomacy conducted between colonizing European powers prior to the war. The main characteristic of the open diplomacy is to all the negotiations between countries should proceed openly in the public view, as secret talks and agreements reached before the First World War between the major powers were partly blamed for the start of the war. Coercive diplomacy refers to the usage of threat of force by state or group of states to achieve its objectives in international relations. Coercive diplomacy usually involves the military strategy to force other states or non-state actors to behave in certain manner. Difference from the use of military force is that in coercive diplomacy, it is a threat of using military force rather than the actual use of military force that is used to achieve the intended results. One of the most important examples of the use of coercive diplomacy in history is the strategy followed by US President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. He decided to place a naval blockade around Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from delivering military supplies to Cuba and also demand the removal of the missiles, which were already brought to Cuba cowardly. As a result of the threat to use force, as well as the US promise to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, the Soviet Union decided to remove its missiles from Cuba. Diplomatic protocol essentially defines how diplomatic personnel and other state officials should behave towards each other in international arena under specific circumstances. In general, it covers guidelines, etiquette, and accepted behaviors in diplomacy. The protocol and the ceremonial activities are important ways of expression for states in international affairs. It establishes the framework to develop relations between states. Diplomacy is conducted by diplomatic staff and other personnel attached to states' diplomatic representations abroad. Any state's diplomatic institutions have three types of representation abroad: symbolic, legal, and political. Symbolically, they are the representatives of their countries in the host country and talk on behalf of their home countries. Legally, their properly authorized actions would be binding for the countries they represent. Politically, they are conveyors of policies and principles of their countries in foreign policy area. While doing their job in abroad, diplomats enjoy legal diplomatic immunity, ensuring that diplomats, while pursuing their diplomatic duties, are not subject to the jurisdiction of the host countries. The modern diplomatic immunity was codified by the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1861 and the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations of 1863. The principal idea of the diplomatic immunity is to ensure the continuation of communication and exchange of information between the states, even in difficult times, including armed conflict. Together with the traditional mechanisms in the customary law, Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961 regulated diplomatic immunity in Article 29 to 63. According to the convention, a diplomatic agent and his or her family enjoy immunity from the criminal, civil, and administrative jurisdiction of the receiving state. The main functions of any form of diplomacy are talks and negotiations. While the diplomatic talks mostly involve exchange of views and information between states, negotiations are structured talks to achieve an agreement by a process of a give and take. These agreements can be bilateral or multilateral, as achieving consensus on every aspect of multilateral contracts are usually difficult. Some states may choose to declare their reservations or objections to some aspects of the proposed arrangements, but let it function with the agreement of the rest of the parties. Although diplomacy is by definition involves more than one state, unilateral actions of a state may sometimes be considered as a form of diplomatic communication. For example, recall or expulsion of diplomats or suspension of diplomatic relations are unilateral actions with bilateral results. States use different types of economic instruments in their foreign policy international relations. Propaganda is one of them. Propaganda plays an important role in influencing other countries' opinions, actions, and/or policies in ways benefiting the country that initiated the propaganda actions. It plays an important role in foreign policy of states, especially in crisis time, including the times of war and conflicts. In such cases, it could be transformed into psychological warfare with the inclusion of covert cooperatives and means to conduct propaganda actions. On the other side, the concept of public diplomacy has gained importance since the end of the Cold War. It is the usage of propaganda methods to explain a state's foreign policy actions to its own citizens rather than populations of other states. In this sense, propaganda can target 5 different audiences. The first one is citizens of the state managing the propaganda. Secondly, citizens of friendly nations. Thirdly, citizens of neutral or unrelated countries. Fourthly, citizens of the enemy states. And finally, fifthly, wider general international and domestic public. Public diplomacy is also used sometimes to disseminate information to one's own country in order to garner or enhance public support for certain policies of the government. In this regard, can be counted the main targets of international propaganda. As we said, citizens of the state managing the propaganda, citizens of friendly nations, citizens of neutral or unrelated countries, citizens of the enemy states, wider general information, international and domestic public. One of the most important aspects of the international propaganda is its value of authenticity. Spreading disinformation, on the other hand, especially with malicious intent, is considered more like a covert operation, and thus the increasing use of fake news in the traditional media or on the internet is not an acceptable form of propaganda. The value of economic methods as foreign policy instruments arises from the fact that economically all states are in varying degrees dependent on one another. Since economy is a vital lifeline for states, the usage of economic instruments in foreign policy to force, coerce, or persuade the other states to behave in certain ways has always been an important tool of states. However, it has gained more importance in modern times with the increasing interdependence of states. In this context, there are 2 major types of economic methods: foreign and development aid, and trade-related economic instruments. Although the foreign aid and economic assistance are usually perceived as the positive ways of persuasion, they can also be used coercively in a negative form, such as refusing, withholding, or ending the aid and/or economic assistance. Although developed countries had traditionally employed foreign aid and economic assistance as foreign policy instruments in order to maintain or expand their influence in the international arena, developing countries, with the increasing interdependence of national economies, have also started to use them in conjunction with their foreign policy aims. In addition to foreign aid and economic assistance, states can also employ such trade-related instruments as quota, tariff, blacklist, boycott, embargo, and blockade, either positively or coercively to influence targeted states' behavior in the international arena. While blacklist, boycott, embargo, and blockade are exclusively coercive methods, quota and tariff can be used either coercively or positively. While most of these instruments can be used in peacetime to influence foreign policy actions of a specific state or group of states, blockade, when used in wartime, would result in legal consequences for both target state and also third parties. Quota is basically creating a quantitative restriction for a state's exports or imports. First imposition of quotas on a large scale was used immediately after the First World War. Quotas can also be used to control market price of specific materials such as oil. Tariff is a tax or duty to be paid on the particular class of imports or exports. Tariffs are generally used by governments to protect domestic industries from international competition or to create revenue. There are mainly 2 types of tariffs: specific and ad valorem tariff. Blacklist is a declaration by a country of a list of people and or companies of other countries that trade relations would not be allowed with. Normally, only the citizens of the country that declare the blacklist wouldn't be allowed to trade with blacklist people and companies wherever they are in the world. Boycott aims to prevent their importing certain goods from the boycotted country or less frequently exporting certain products in that country. Boycott usually applies as a reaction to some policies of country against which the boycott is launched. Citizens of a country that feels wronged rather than states usually launch boycotts, and it could either be unilateral or applied in cooperation with the citizens of other countries. Embargo traditionally and legally meant preventing ships in a certain country's ports or territorial waters from leaving or transporting that country's goods. This kind of embargo could be applied both in peacetime and wartime. In practice, however, the meaning of embargo has expanded in time to cover goods, and thus came to be defined as official ban on trade or other commercial activity with a particular country. In most cases, embargo is applied for certain items such as weapons, sensitive substance. An embargo can be implemented by individual state or a group of countries or regional or international organizations. Blockade is a trade-related economic instrument that can be used both in peacetime and wartime. In peacetime blockade, a state tries to block entrance and exit of ships carrying the flag of a country that it's blockading into its harbors with its navy, while peacetime blockade is in principle applies only to the ships of the blockade country. In practice, it's applied to third countries' ships. As a wartime instrument, blockade means prevention of ships with naval presence from entering and leaving certain parts of enemy states' territorial waters. As access to open seas is totally prevented from a country's coastline, this wouldn't only be imposed on the enemy state, but also affects neutral or friendly states. Dear students, thank you very much for following the chapter 7, the book of the foreign policy analysis.